An Apache woman closed her eyes to die, but woke up in a cowboy's bed instead. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you were watching from. The cold was sharper in the northern hills than in town, the kind that made a man's teeth ache and his breath sting when he drew it in. Sheriff Luke Carver leaned forward in the saddle, gloved hands tight on the reins, his horse's hooves crunching through the crust of old snow. Patrols this far out were thankless, but he made them anyway. He told himself it was duty, keeping an eye out for drifters, outlaws, or hunters who thought they could slip through without paying the town's tax. But truthfully, it was the silence he needed. Silence meant no one asking questions he didn't want to answer. No faces expecting him to fill the room with talk when he had nothing left to say. Luke was 32, still young by most measures, but his body carried the weight of years spent in uniform before he ever pinned a badge. The war had given him scars no one could see, and when he came west, he figured the land might give him peace. Instead, it gave him a badge in a town too small to matter to anyone but those living there. Still, he wore it and carried it like a burden. By daylight, he kept order. At night, he returned to his cabin, ate alone, slept alone, woke alone. He told himself he didn't mind. He was far from town, his horse damp with sweat, when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a discarded bundle near the tree line, a dark shape against the pale snow, motionless. He slowed, scanning the trees for ambush. Raids had been real enough last fall, and settlers had been quick to take vengeance where they could, not always caring who they hurt. He touched the butt of his Colt out of habit, then dismounted, boots crunching as he stepped toward the shape. It was a woman curled against a fallen pine, her limbs stiff from the cold, her face slack in unconsciousness. Her skin was bronze, her lips tinged blue, her hair black and stiff with frost where it spread across the snow. The deerskin dress she wore had been torn apart. One strap snapped, the fabric ripped along her ribs and hip. Bare skin showed through in the open gaps, skin that was bruised in places, raw in others. Luke's stomach tightened. It wasn't just the cold that had brought her here. Someone had left her like this, or worse, thrown her aside after using her. He crouched down and pressed a hand to her neck. A pulse beat faintly under chilled skin, so weak he almost missed it. He pulled his hand back and looked around again, listening hard. No voices, no tracks fresh in the snow, but his own. Whoever had been here was gone. The only question left was whether to risk taking her in. He weighed it carefully. She was Apache. Her features, her dress, the beadwork still clinging to one strap of hide told him that. Bringing her to town would be a mistake. There were men in Cold Ridge who would sooner see her dead than sheltered, and women who would spit at her feet. He couldn't leave her, though. Whatever she'd done, or whatever someone claimed she'd done, leaving her here meant death, and he couldn't ride past with that on his conscience. His father had taught him better. Luke slid his arms under her, lifting her off the snow. She was lighter than she should have been, her body tense with chill, her breath shallow against his chest. She stirred once, eyes fluttering half open, and whispered a sound he couldn't make out. Maybe a name, maybe nothing. Then she sagged again, limp in his arms. The ride back was slow, the added weight dragging his horse, the sky turning darker by the minute. He wrapped his coat around her, keeping her pressed close, trying not to think about how fragile her breathing sounded each time the horse stumbled. Fear cut through him, sharper than the wind. Fear that she'd slip away before they reached the cabin. Fear that the lawman in him was about to carry a body home to bury. By the time the cabin came into view, smoke from his last fire still faint in the chimney, his arms were numb from holding her steady. He kicked the door open, carried her inside, and set her down on his bed. The only bed in the room, narrow and neatly kept until now. He laid her on the quilts, pulled the lamp closer, and took a long look. Bruises colored her ribs and thigh. Her shoulder bore a mark he couldn't place. Burned, not cut, old enough to scar, but still red at the edges. Whoever had done this hadn't just abandoned her. They had broken her first. Luke lit the stove until it glowed, filled the kettle, and set broth to warm. His hands shook a little as he worked. He wasn't the kind of man who let emotions show, never had been, but the sight of her stirred something he didn't want to name. Pity, maybe, Anger, surely, but also a deep, steady resolve. When he touched a damp cloth to her lips, her eyes flickered open again. Dark eyes, sharp even in their haze, locked on his face for a heartbeat. There was no mistaking the fear there. Not fear of death. She had already given herself to that, but fear of what he might take from her before it came. Luke pulled back slightly, holding her gaze steady and calm. "You're safe here," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure she understood. "Not going to hurt you." Her eyelids sank shut, but her breathing steadied a little. Luke sat in the chair by the bed, waiting while the broth cooled, watching her chest rise and fall. He didn't know why she had been left there or what kind of danger she would bring to his door when word got out. All he knew was that he couldn't ride past. Not this time, not her. That decision, made on a frozen night in the timberline, would change everything. The fire had burned down to coals by the time Luke let his eyes close, though he never really slept. He sat slumped in the chair beside the bed, one hand resting near his Colt on the table, the other still stiff from carrying her weight through the snow. Every small sound, the pop of sap in the stove, the hiss of wind squeezing through the cracks in the shutters, kept him half alert. Each time she stirred beneath the quilt, his head came up fast, the old soldier in him refusing rest. By dawn, his eyes burned from the long watch. When the first light pushed through the window chinks, he leaned forward and checked her breathing again. She was warmer now, though still weak. Her face had lost some of its blue tinge, and her chest rose more evenly under the quilt. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time in years, he felt a knot of responsibility heavier than his badge. He had brought her here, and whatever happened next rested on him. He pulled on his boots, fed the stove, and went outside to draw water from the barrel. The world was white and brittle with frost, the snow piled high against the cabin's back wall. He paused at the door, scanning the tree line. No tracks but his own, no smoke in the distance. Whoever had left her to die had done it far from here. Still, he knew men in town would ask questions if they saw her. Some would want answers, others would want blood. When he stepped back inside, the cabin air already warmer, he saw her eyes open for the first time with awareness behind them. She lay still, her hair tangled across the pillow, her body pulled tight under the quilt. Her gaze locked on him as soon as the door shut, sharp and guarded. He could see the flicker of fear tighten her jaw. He set the bucket down slowly, keeping his movements calm. "You're awake," he said. His voice sounded rough in the small room. He realized he hadn't spoken more than a few words in nearly a week. "Name's Luke Carver, Sheriff." She studied him silently. He could tell she was measuring him, trying to decide if he was another kind of danger. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out. After a long hesitation, she pushed herself up on one elbow and took it with shaking hands. She drank in small sips, her eyes never leaving his. Her lips parted finely, voice hoarse. "Naeli." Just one word, but it was enough to ground her as more than a body he had carried from the snow. Luke nodded. "Naeli," he repeated, the name unfamiliar but steady on his tongue. He set bread and beans on the table, warming them in the pan and brought a plate to her. She ate carefully like someone who hadn't known regular meals in a long time, and he noticed the bruises more clearly now in the lamplight. Marks on her ribs, welts on her thighs, an older scar burned into her shoulder. He looked away before she caught him staring, not wanting her to mistake his concern for something else. Still, he couldn't avoid the questions pressing against his chest. Who had done this to her? Why was she left to freeze? And why here, so close to the timberline where he always rode? She gave him no answers yet, and he didn't ask. He knew better than to push. Survival came first. Trust would take time. He stood, took his coat, and moved toward the door. "I need to ride into town. Check the post," he said, pausing with his hand on the latch. "You'll be safe here. Firewood stacked. Stove will hold." He met her eyes again, holding them long enough to make sure she believed him. She gave the smallest nod, but her fingers clutched the quilt tighter around her chest. Luke stepped outside, the cold cutting him sharply after the cabin's heat. He mounted his horse and turned down the trail, but his thoughts stayed behind. He replayed the image of her lying in his bed, eyes sharp despite exhaustion, body marked by violence and cold. He thought about the town, how they would look at her, what they would say if they knew she was under his roof. He had kept law here for years and never once invited anyone past his threshold. He had lived carefully, kept his distance. Now, one choice on a frozen night had broken that distance, and he couldn't bring himself to regret it. When he returned with salt, flour, and coffee from the general store, she was sitting upright by the stove, wrapped in his quilt, mending the torn strap of her dress with clumsy thread from his sewing tin. The fabric still hung loose, exposing more of her body than she likely wanted, but she worked with determination. Her eyes lifted when he came in. For the first time, they didn't hold fear. They held something harder to place, weary acknowledgement, maybe even the faintest trace of trust. Luke set the supplies down, his jaw tightening with the weight of it. Whatever her story was, it wasn't over, and whether he liked it or not, he was part of it now. The day stretched quietly inside the cabin, the kind of quiet that was not empty but filled with small sounds. Wood settling in the stove, water boiling, the scratch of a needle through cloth. Luke had returned from town with supplies and put them in their places on the shelves, all while feeling Nellie's eyes follow him from her seat near the fire. She stayed wrapped in his quilt, her torn dress clutched underneath, sewing slowly, her fingers clumsy with the stiff thread, but refusing to stop. He realized then that he had never asked her if she could sew or if she even wanted to. It struck him he knew nothing of her life, not where she came from, not how long she had been running, not whether she had family. People in town would have asked those questions right away, most with judgment already in their voice. But Luke had held back. He wasn't sure if it was kindness or fear of what the answers might mean. When he sat at the table, she lifted her head. Why? Her voice was rough, like each word cost her something. Luke paused, unsure. Why what? Her eyes stayed sharp, steady. Why did you carry me? You could have left. The question was fair. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed on a knot in the wood floorboards. Didn't seem right, he said finally. Ain't law to leave a body in the snow when it's still breathing. He wanted to leave it there, but the truth pushed harder. I seen too much of that in the war. Too many men walk past folks who might have lived if someone had stopped. Nellie watched him for a long time before turning her gaze back to the dress. She didn't thank him. He hadn't expected her to, but her hands moved slower, steadier, as though his answer had taken some weight from her. By evening, she was strong enough to stand on her own and insisted on carrying a bucket of water from the barrel outside. Luke followed a few paces behind, ready to catch her as she stumbled. The cold bit hard at her bare feet, and when he noticed the raw skin, he silently fetched a pair of wool socks from his trunk and set them by the fire later. She said nothing when she saw them waiting, only slipped them on without comment, but he caught the way her shoulders eased once she did. That night, after buttons, he lit the lamp and sat at the table to clean his Colt. The cabin smelled of gun oil and beans cooling on the stove. Nellie sat across from him, her quilt draped loosely now, her dress patched enough to stay in place. The bruises on her shoulder had darkened, and in the lamplight, he could see the scar burned into her skin more clearly. It wasn't an accident, too precise, too deliberate. He wanted to ask, but held his tongue. She wasn't ready to share, and he wasn't ready to hear what kind of men left that kind of mark. Instead, he asked something simpler. You got people somewhere? Her eyes flickered. She stared into the lamplight as if weighing her words. Not anymore. That was all she gave, and it was enough to close the subject. Luke nodded once, slowly. He didn't press. He knew what it meant to lose people. He had buried enough of his own during the war. He returned to his work, the steady click of the revolver cylinder filling the room, and she returned to sewing, the two of them bound by a silence that no longer felt like a wall, but like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Later, when the fire had burned low and the cabin chilled, Luke dragged his chair closer to the stove to doze lightly, the way he always did. But when he glanced at the bed, Nellie had shifted to the far side, leaving a space beside her. Her eyes were half closed, but she was watching him, still, steady as ever. He hesitated, his chest tightening, the decision sharp in his mind. If he lay down beside her, it would change things. If he stayed in the chair, the distance would stay fixed. He didn't move, Not yet. Instead, he pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, settled back in the chair, and let his eyes drift shut. Her breathing steadied, and in that steady rhythm, he found a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. What he didn't see as the fire cracked low was the way she finally let her hand rest on the space where he might have been, testing the ground between them, waiting to see if it would hold. The storm came in suddenly, hard, and without warning. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of lead, the trees bowing under wind that howled through the ridge like a freight train. Luke had seen enough winters to know what was coming. He checked the shutters twice, laid extra wood by the stove, and made sure the latch on the door was tight. By the time darkness fell, snow was hammering against the cabin walls, and the wind drowned every other sound. Inside, the fire glowed, but the cold pressed through anyway, the kind that slipped into bones and didn't let go. Nieli sat on the bed, wrapped in his quilt, watching him with weary eyes. She had eaten earlier, beans and bread, all she could manage, and though color had returned to her face, her body still carried the sharp lines of hunger. The patched dress clung unevenly, her collarbone stark above the neckline, her legs tucked under the blanket to keep warm. Luke could see her shiver even from across the room. He poured hot water into a tin mug and set it beside her. "Drink, helps keep the cold out." She took it, her hands trembling against the metal, and drank slowly. Her gaze flicked to the window where snow streaked across the cracks. "This storm," she said, voice tight, "it will not stop soon." Luke shook his head. "Could be all night, maybe longer." She lowered her eyes, silent, then pulled the quilt tighter. Luke busied himself with small tasks, oiling the rifle, checking the kettle. But every few minutes his eyes returned to her. He could see the way she fought against showing weakness, her jaw clenched even as her body shook. He understood it. Pride was all a person had when everything else was taken. But he also knew that cold like this wasn't a matter of pride. It could kill as quickly as a bullet where shivering worsened. He made his choice. He set the rifle aside and crossed to the bed. She tensed when he sat down on the edge, her eyes locking onto his as if to read what he meant. He kept his voice even. "You won't make it through the night like this. The fire's not enough. Body heat's the only thing that works." Her lips pressed tightly, her breathing quick. For a moment he thought she would refuse, and he prepared himself to step back, to let her decide. But then she gave a single small nod, her hand still clutching the quilt as if it were her last shield. Luke pulled his boots off and eased onto the bed, careful not to crowd her. The quilt shifted as he lay beside her, the warmth of his body seeping across the narrow space. At first she stayed rigid, her back half turned, but the cold pushed harder. And finally she pressed closer, her forehead brushing his shoulder, her hand resting uncertainly against his chest. He felt her pulse through her fingers, fast, unsteady, but alive. He didn't move to hold her, didn't let his hands wander. He kept still, his breath even, his body heat given without demand. Slowly her shivering eased. In the quiet that followed, questions surfaced, questions left unspoken since the night he carried her in entity. He wondered if she had been abandoned by her own people or sold off by settlers, wondered what violence had left the bruises, wondered how long she had been running. He also wondered what it meant that she was here in his bed, not as a woman he had claimed, but as a life he had saved. Nieli's breathing steadied against him, and at last her voice came, low and halting. "I thought I would die out there. I closed my eyes and waited, but I woke here." Luke turned his head, meeting her gaze in the lamplight. There was no gratitude in her eyes yet. Not exactly, but there was a raw honesty he hadn't seen before. "Not on my watch," he said, his voice rough but steady. She studied him, then let her forehead rest fully against his chest. Sleep took her not long after, her hand still resting against him. Luke lay awake longer, the storm outside battering the cabin, thinking about what it meant to share his bed for the first time in years. It wasn't intimacy, not yet. It was survival. But it had changed something between them, and he knew when the storm broke, nothing would be quite the same again. The storm broke by morning, leaving a world covered in deep drifts that reached halfway up the fence rails. The cabin stood steady, smoke still curling from the chimney, but the silence outside was heavy, almost smothering, as though the snow itself pressed against every sound. Inside, Luke moved carefully from the stove to the table, pouring hot coffee into a tin cup while watching Niele stir under the quilt. She shifted slowly, her face softer from rest. But when her eyes opened, the weariness returned like a reflex. She had survived the night. That much was certain. Her skin had warmth now, her breathing stronger, her shoulders no longer shaking uncontrollably. Yet Luke knew survival wasn't the only thing at stake. If she was to remain under his roof, questions would come. The town wasn't blind, and in Coldridge, nothing stayed secret for long. He set the cup down near her. "You'll need strength. We have to go into town." Her eyes sharpened instantly, her fingers clutching the quilt tightly. "Town." Her voice was edged with fear. Luke nodded. "Supplies are low, flour, medicine, a few things I can't go without. If I ride alone, folks will ask where I've been, why I need double the food. Won't take long before they come looking themselves. Better they see you with me, under my protection." She searched his face as though trying to measure whether he was telling her the whole truth. In her silence, Luke felt the weight of what she must have endured. Settlers who treated her as less than human, men who saw her as trade. He kept his voice steady. "I won't let anyone touch you, not in town, not anywhere." By mid-morning, the sky had cleared enough for travel. Luke saddled his horse and built a crude second seat from rope and blanket. When she stepped outside, wrapped in a spare coat that hung heavily on her shoulders, her eyes darted across the endless white, as if she expected danger in every drift. She climbed onto the horse behind him, her hands light on his waist, not for closeness, but for balance. The ride was long and slow, the snow deep, but the closer they came to town, the more tension coiled in Luke's chest. He knew Coldridge, knew every set of eyes that would follow them. He had kept his distance from most folk, respected for his badge, but never known well enough for talk. Bringing her with him would break that distance for good. When they reached the main street, heads turned immediately. A rancher paused mid-step outside the livery. Two women carrying baskets stopped and whispered behind their shawls. At the saloon, a pair of men leaned out into the street, grinning sharply and ugly. Luke kept his face hard, his hand resting near his belt, daring anyone to come closer. He dismounted in front of the general store and helped Niele down. She kept her chin lowered, her dark hair falling across her face, but he noticed her shoulders squared, her back straight, pride even in fear. Inside the store, the owner, Ezra Maddox, froze at the sight of her. His eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin. "Sheriff," he said carefully, his gaze flicking between Luke and Niele, "didn't know you'd taken to bringing company." Luke stacked flour and coffee on the counter, his voice low but sharp. "I'll pay in full." Ezra's eyes lingered on Niele, the disapproval plain. "You sure it's wise?" Luke cut him off with a glance that ended the sentence. "Put it on the scale, Ezra." The rest of the town felt the weight of that moment. By the time Luke led Niele back to the horse, the whispers had grown, but no one stepped forward. His presence, steady, armed, unflinching, was enough to keep distance. Still, he knew this was only the beginning. Back at the cabin, Niele removed the coat and sat by the fire, her hands tight around the quilt again. "They hate me," she said quietly, her voice carrying no surprise, only resignation. Luke hung his hat, set the supplies down, and turned to her. "They don't know you. They only know what they've been told. But they'll think twice before crossing me." Her eyes lifted, meeting his. "And if they come anyway?" He held her gaze, steady as stone. "Then they'll answer to me." For the first time, she let out a breath that sounded close to relief. It wasn't trust yet, not fully, but it was the beginning of something she hadn't had in a long time. Protection without a price. As the firelight flickered over the two of them, Luke knew the path ahead had narrowed. Whatever his life had been before, it was now bound to hers, and there would be no turning back. The days that followed their first trip into town settled into a rhythm that felt different from Luke's life before. The cabin, once a place of silence, broken only by the crackle of the stove or the scrape of a chair, now carried the sound of two people moving through it. At first, the change was jarring. Luke had lived years in routines where no one asked where he went or noticed when he came back. Now when he opened the door after patrol, he found Nielli there, sitting by the fire, mending cloth, boiling beans, or simply watching the snow outside, as if waiting to see if the world would turn against her again. He made a habit of splitting wood in the mornings, stacking it along the cabin wall where the sun hit strongest, and she often joined him. At first she only watched, but within days she took to carrying the smaller pieces inside. He caught her once dragging a log too heavy for her thin frame and stopped her with a sharp word. She met his eyes with stubborn pride and snapped back, "I am not weak." That was the first time he had heard anger in her voice, and it startled him. He said nothing then, only took the log from her hands and set it down. Later that night, he left a smaller axe by the door without explanation. The next morning, she used it without comment, cutting kindling while he worked the larger logs, and for the first time, they labored side by side without unease. The townsfolk's whispers had followed him back from Coldridge, but no one confronted him openly. Still, Luke could feel the weight of it when he rode his rounds, the glances from ranchers, the too long stares at the saloon. He didn't tell Nielli how sharp the gossip had grown. He saw no use in burdening her with what she already suspected. Instead, he focused on the cabin, on making sure it was supplied, steady, and warm. The outside world could press against his door, but inside, he wanted her to feel it was hers as much as his. One evening after a long day, he came in to find the quilt folded neatly and the bed made with precision. She had cooked beans and salt pork, sitting on the table without a word. For a man who had eaten cold meals on patrol more times than he could count, the sight of a meal waiting, of someone else choosing to prepare it, struck deeper than he expected. He sat across from her, eating slowly, aware of her eyes on him. "You always live alone?" she asked finally, her voice careful. Luke nodded. "Always?" He didn't add the rest, that even when surrounded by soldiers, by townsfolk, by men who called him sheriff, he had never let anyone close enough to change that fact. Nellie lowered her gaze, pushing beans around her plate. "Alone is easier. No one can hurt you when there is no one to lose." He recognized the truth in her words, but also heard the grief. For the first time, he wanted to ask directly about her past, about the scar on her shoulder, about who had left her in the snow, but he stopped himself. The time would come when she chose to tell it, and when she did, it had to be her choice. Instead, he reached for the pot and filled her plate again. "You won't go hungry here," he said simply. That night, the stove burned low, and they sat in the half-dark. Nielli braided her hair with slow, practiced hands, her head bent while Luke sharpened his knife at the table. The firelight caught the shape of her face, her features drawn but no longer gone, her eyes sharper, alive. She lifted her head once, catching him watching. For a moment, neither looked away. Then she let the braid fall over her shoulder and returned to her work. But a faint softness had settled in her expression. When Luke finally lay down, he expected her to keep her usual distance. Instead, as the cold pressed through the shutters, she shifted closer, her hand brushing his arm, deliberate but cautious. His breath caught, not from surprise, but from the weight of what it meant. He didn't pull away. Slowly, she left her hand there, her body curling toward him for warmth. Not from the storm this time, but from choice. Luke lay awake longer, staring at the ceiling beams, realizing that the silence between them had changed. It was no longer just survival, it was trust beginning to take root. Fragile, but real. He knew in his gut that if the town or the past tried to take that away, he would not stand by. He would fight it, no matter the cost. The thaw began to creep in, the snow softening underfoot, water running down from the hills in thin streams that turned the ground to mud. The mountains still loomed white, but the grip of winter was breaking, and with it, the days in Luke's cabin shifted into something quieter, steadier. Routine had become second nature. Luke cutting wood and riding patrol, Nielli tending the fire, sewing, preparing meals. What had started as survival was now a life shared, and though neither spoke the words, both knew it. The townsfolk had not let the matter rest. Luke heard it every time he passed through Coldridge. The muttered voices outside the livery, the sharp stares from men who spat into the dirt when he walked by. The saloon barkeep made a joke one night. too loud, and though Luke didn't react, he stored the sound of laughter in the back of his mind, filing it away like a name on a wanted poster. Still, no one dared to challenge him openly. His badge and his reputation held them at bay, but he knew it couldn't last forever. Whispers had a way of growing teeth. Back at the cabin, Nayeli had changed too. She no longer flinched at every sudden sound, no longer kept her quilt clutched like armor around her shoulders. She wore the patched dress she had mended and sometimes stepped outside to stand under the open sky, breathing in the crisp air as if relearning what it felt like to exist beyond fear. Luke noticed the way her body carried strength now. Her shoulders no longer slumped, her steps firmer on the thawing ground. The bruises faded, but the scar on her shoulder remained, and though she never spoke of it, he saw the way her hands sometimes brushed it absent-mindedly, as though reminding herself that it no longer defined her. One evening after supper, Luke sat cleaning his rifle at the table while Nellie brushed out her hair by the fire. The lamplight caught her face, her hair falling loosely down her back, and Luke found himself watching longer than he intended. She glanced up, caught his gaze, and instead of looking away, held it. "You don't ask me questions," she said finally, her voice steady but low. Luke set the rifle aside. "Not my right to force answers. You'll tell me what you want when you want." Her eyes softened, though her lips pressed thin. "I was taken before the snow," she said, almost to the fire instead of him. "Traitors, they sold me like meat. I escaped when they fought among themselves. I ran until I could not anymore. I thought dying in the snow was better than going back." Luke's chest tightened, anger flashing quickly, but he kept it contained. "You're not going back," he said simply, his voice like iron. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then she rose, crossing the room to where he sat. She stood close, the firelight warming her skin, her eyes searching his face as if weighing whether he meant what he said. Her hand lifted, brushing against his cheek with hesitation, then resting there. Luke stayed still, his breath caught, his thoughts sharp. He had held back for weeks, afraid of what it might mean to cross the line between protector and something more. But as she leaned closer, her lips finding his, the hesitation broke. The kiss was slow, unsure at first, then deepened, carrying the weight of everything unspoken between them. When they parted, her forehead rested against his, her breath quick. "You treat me as if I am not broken," she whispered. Luke's hand rose, steady against her back. "Because you're not," he said. The fire burned low as they stayed close, neither retreating. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, carrying with it the sound of a world that would never understand what had been built in silence between a lawman and the woman he had saved. Inside, the line they had both held so carefully was gone, replaced by something fragile, human, and real. Luke knew the town would come for answers soon, maybe worse, but he also knew one thing for certain. He would not face it alone, not anymore. The days following their first kiss carried a quiet charge, something new in the cabin air that both of them felt but neither named. Luke went about his duties as always, splitting logs, riding into town for supplies, checking on the outlying ranches. But now, when he returned home, his eyes searched for her first thing. Each time he saw her by the fire or bent over her sewing, he felt something tighten in his chest. Nellie moved differently too, no longer clinging to the quilt for cover, no longer shrinking into herself when his gaze lingered. She carried herself with a mix of caution and growing trust, testing each step forward in the unspoken bond between them. Town remained restless. Whispers grew louder, though still behind Luke's back. He heard them when he passed through, the suggestion that he had taken her as a prize, the insinuation that a sheriff had no business living with an Apache woman. He didn't answer the talk, but it burned in him, and more than once, he caught his hand resting on the grip of his Colt longer than necessary. Each ride back to the cabin, he feared the ugliness of town might follow. But each time he pushed through the door and saw Nellie alive and warm, that fear dulled into resolve. One evening, the wind came up sharply, rattling the shutters, though no storm followed. The stove glowed steadily, the room heavy with the smell of beans simmering low. Luke sat at the table, boots unlaced, his body aching from the day's ride. Niele set down the bowls and sat across from him. They ate in silence at first, until she set her spoon aside and studied him. "You hear what they say about me," she said, her voice even. Luke met her eyes. "I hear, doesn't matter." Her brow tightened. "It does to them. They think I am shame, a burden, maybe worse." He leaned forward, his tone flat. "Let them think it. They don't decide what you are. They don't decide what I choose." Her eyes searched his, and after a long moment, she nodded. Something in her posture shifted then, not lighter but steadier, like she believed him. She stood, took the bowls, and set them aside, then crossed the small room to where he sat. Without speaking, she laid her hand on his shoulder. Luke froze, his breath catching, then let himself lean into her touch. The fire burned lower. As the hours passed, when Luke rose to lay more wood, Niele moved with him, her hand brushing his arm deliberately. He turned, and before he could think, she stepped closer, her lips finding his again. This time there was no hesitation. The kiss deepened, her hands gripping his shirt, his arms circling her waist and drawing her against him. Months of silence, of restraint, of distance collapsed in that moment, replaced by heat and certainty. He lifted her easily, setting her gently onto the bed. The quilt slipped, her patched dress shifting loosely at the seams. She didn't cover herself, not this time. Instead, she met his eyes with steady resolve. Luke held her face in his hands, his voice rough, almost broken. "Only if you want this." "I want," she whispered, her hand pressed against his chest. The night stretched long, filled with closeness neither had allowed before. It was not desperate or hurried, but slow and deliberate, each touch careful, each kiss deepened by trust earned across long, cold weeks. For Niele, it was proof she was more than what had been done to her. For Luke, it was proof he wasn't meant to live and die alone. When morning came, pale light spilling through the shutter cracks, Niele lay curled against his chest, her breathing even, her hand resting steadily on his skin. Luke stayed still, staring at the ceiling beams, his thoughts sharp and sure. The world outside would not accept this, but the cabin was no longer only his. It was theirs, and no law, no whisper, no man could take that from him without a fight. The thaw came stronger, the creek behind the cabin rushing loudly with snowmelt, the ground softening under the horses' hooves. Luke woke earlier than usual, the sun not yet over the ridge, and for the first time in years, he didn't rise to silence. Niele lay against him, her hair loose across the quilt, her breathing even, her hand still resting where it had fallen over his chest in the night. He stayed still longer than he should have, watching the way light touched her face, the quiet dignity she carried even in sleep. For a man who had lived years with nothing but his badge and the emptiness of routine, it was a sight he hadn't dared believe he'd ever know. When she stirred awake, her eyes opened slowly but sharply, and for a moment she looked at him as though testing whether what had happened between them was real. Luke spoke first, his voice low. "You belong here. If you want it, this is your home." Her lips pressed together, her throat working as if the words caught hard. "In the town, they will not stop. They hate me." Luke sat up, pulling on his shirt, his jaw set. "Then let them. I've kept law here for years, and I've done it alone. I'm done standing alone. If they want to call it shame, let them say it to my face." That day he saddled his horse and rode with her into Cold Ridge. Not at dawn when few were awake, but near midday when the street was full. Ranch hands outside the saloon, women carrying baskets, boys playing in the dirt road. Heads turned as they came down the main street. Luke rode straight, his badge pinned clearly. Niele sat firmly behind him. When he dismounted, he helped her down, his hand steady at her back, and walked her with him into the general store. Ezra Maddox stood behind the counter, his mouth pinched as it had been before. But Luke cut off any word with a steady voice. "This is Nellie. She stays under my roof. She eats what I eat, wears what I buy, and no one in this town lays a hand or word against her. Not while I wear this badge." The room went still. Ezra glanced from Luke to the other customers, weighing his words, but one hard look from Luke ended the matter. Ezra rang up the supplies without argument. By the time Luke and Niele walked back into the sunlight, Whispers filled the street, but no one stepped forward. The lawman had spoken clearly enough. Back at the cabin, Nellie stood on the porch while Luke unloaded the supplies. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You tied your name to mine. That cannot be undone." Luke straightened, meeting her eyes. "I didn't tie it. I gave it, if you'll have it." Her hand tightened at the edge of the railing, her voice unsteady but certain. "I will." The weeks that followed carried more work, fencing, planting, long days where the cabin filled with the smell of earth and firewood. But the air between them was no longer uncertain. At night they lay close without hesitation, her hand finding his arms steady around her. The scar on her shoulder no longer looked like a mark of what had been done to her, but a mark of what she had endured, and Luke found himself tracing it, not with pity, but with respect. By late spring, he built a cradle from pine, the boards plain and smooth. Not because a child was expected yet, but because Nellie had once spoken of her mother making them, and he had listened. When he carried it into the cabin, she stood silently for a long time before laying her hand on it. "You remember," she said softly. "I remember everything," Luke answered. The cabin that had been only his now held two lives bound together. The town would never fully approve, but it no longer mattered. Sheriff Luke Carver, who had spent years returning home to nothing but smoke and silence, now had someone waiting by the fire, someone who had come to his bed to die, but stayed to live. Nieli, who had fled violence and closed her eyes to the snow, now opened them each morning in a place that was hers by choice, not by force. Their story didn't end with distance or doubt. It ended here in a cabin at the edge of the timberline, with the sound of thawing earth outside and the certainty of belonging inside. The man who had belonged to no one and the woman who had been claimed by no one now belonged only to each other. The story of Sheriff Luke Carver and Nellie offers a powerful lesson. True strength lies in choosing compassion over indifference, even when it invites judgment or risk. Luke, a man scarred by war and solitude, finds Nieli, an Apache woman left to die in the snow, her body marked by violence and betrayal. Instead of passing by, he carries her to safety, defying the prejudice of Coldridge, where whispers and stares threaten their fragile bond. Nieli, once resigned to death, finds in Luke a protector who sees her not as broken but as whole, giving her space to rebuild trust and reclaim her dignity. Their relationship, born in silence and deepened by shared resilience, teaches us that home is not just a place but a choice, to stand by someone, to offer shelter without expectation, and to face the world's scorn for the sake of what's right. Luke's unwavering resolve and Nieli's quiet courage remind us to look beyond fear or bias, to act with humanity and to build connections that heal. This tale stirs the heart, urging us to reflect on the moments we've chosen to help or stay, creating bonds that defy hardship.